Welcome to Lubby's Chat, a podcast about relevant discussions taking place in the Miami-Dade County Public School Board. Your host is the school board member for District 7, Lubby Navarro. Today's episode was recorded online via Zoom call during the 2020 pandemic. Thank you for listening.
I want to welcome everyone to Lubby's Chat. I am Lubby Navarro, school board member for District 7, and it's an honor for me to have our special guest today. I want to welcome Dr. Aileen Marty, a professor of infectious diseases at FIU, Florida International University. Dr. Marty comes with over 40 years of clinical research work in the fields of infectious disease, public health, outbreak response, and mass gatherings. Dr. Marty, welcome.
Thank you, Lubby Navarro. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Dr. Marty, I've had the honor during this pandemic to have many conversations with Dr. Marty, but her public service is beyond anyone's imagination to this community in the middle of this pandemic as a health expert, providing guidance and information and decision-making abilities to many of our local government officials. But to me, I had the honor of appointing her as my appointee for District 7 to the district's, the superintendent's reworking group task force, which was established early on in the pandemic to be able to address the issues of the reopening of schools. And this committee, this task force had several meetings. And I can tell you that the work that Dr. Marty put forth in that task force was really top notch and really was at the center of our guidance to the school board and to the superintendent and our school district as we move forward. So I thought it'd be very important to bring on Dr. Marty, our expert. I always tell people, yes, I'm an elected official, but this is not an event for politicians. This is a clinical event. And for me, it is very, very important to listen to our clinicians. So that is why the voice of Dr. Marty and others in this field, to me, are the strongest voices to guide any governmental body. Dr. Marty, welcome. I want to see if you could give us some information of your valuable work during the reopening task force meetings.
So the superintendent ran these task force meetings along with his entire team, and all the school board members were invited to many of the meetings. So we went over and reviewed what were the risks and benefits of the different ways in which we could provide education to students under these very harsh conditions that exist. And we tried to balance the emotional needs, the educational needs of children with the health risks from this horrific virus that's circulating throughout the world and causing this horrible pandemic. And many different suggestions were reviewed, mechanisms that had to do with how to reduce the risk when people are in the same room. A lot of the science that's coming from not just our own researchers and scientists locally or nationally, but internationally as well, was brought into the equation so that we could provide the best possible, safest options for everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Marty. And, as we begin to look at where we are as a community with the illness still, peaking high, the board made a decision along with the superintendent to open schools virtually from August 31st through September 30th. Obviously, I think that's in adherence with everything we're hearing from the clinical experts. Do you think that when September 30th comes, we'll be in a better position as a community? What are you seeing?
So if you look at what's going on in Miami-Dade right now, and there are many different parts of what's going on that we need to take into consideration. Ultimately, what we really want to know is what is the risk to the children and the teachers and other staff if we open face-to-face schools, and then to their families and the community at large. So in order to have the safest possible education for these children, we need to bring the viral load in our community down. So how do we figure out what the viral load in the community is? And we decided to talk about things that we could measure and follow. And when you look at what's going on in our community right now, over a 14-day period, because that sort of gives us a better idea, since testing is done kind of intermittently. Test results come back intermittently. People don't necessarily start having symptoms at the same time once they've been infected. Some people will come in sooner, some will come in later, some will get very sick, etc. So we had to weigh all that in, and also weigh into the equation what kinds of measures are we putting in place in our community to get the virus out of the community, and how well is the community participating in adhering to these measures so that we can get down to levels that we can safely put children in schools face to face.
Dr. Marty, and you talk about levels, and I've heard in the importance of the 5% versus the 10% positivity. Can you elaborate on that? We all right now don't feel safe. Where will we need to be able to feel safe?
We have to look at what is the guidance that's coming from the institutions that are set up to give us the best guidance for this. And the Center for Disease Control, our federal government's public health agency, set the bar at 10%. The rest of the world set the bar at 5% overall positivity before you could even consider reopening businesses, let alone schools. So in a somewhat of a compromise, we talked about below 10%, trending towards 5%. And then what's really true is that if you're suppressing the virus in your community, then you really ought to be under 3%. And that's why you saw this kind of sliding set of numbers in our recommendations, because what we really want is below 3%. And if we do open schools and we're between 10 and 5%, that's going to require even more robust testing and contact tracing, because the higher the percent of viral load, the more likely it is that we're going to see outbreaks in schools, or that where the index case is a child in a school. To find that out as quickly as possible, we have to have testing capability that is readily available, free, and has a really rapid turnaround. Otherwise, we're going to see a massive spread from any child that brings it into a school. That's the problem. And that's why we really, really want to get it down to below 3%. Because it's so expensive to have all this testing capability and turnaround time and contact tracing. Because as soon as we have a positive case, we have to initiate, and really we should be initiating it the second that that person's test result is positive. And none of that capability exists right now at that level in our community. We don't have enough contact tracers. We don't have a rapid turnaround time for testing. And many people aren't able to access testing as soon as there's a reason for them to do so.
So, Dr. Marty, you feel safe that delaying it, the start, that downtime through the whole month of September will be enough time to bring the numbers down? I know it's still out there. It's still too far out to see. What are your thoughts on that?
We've done an evaluation of what we're doing now, the measures that are in effect, the rate of compliance that we're seeing in our community. And our estimations is that we won't meet those milestones that are in the current plan until late October, early November, if we're lucky. So for us to actually meet these milestones requires an enormous effort by our population to adhere to the recommendations of keeping your distance, wearing the mask, cleaning your hands, don't touch your face, the whole bit. And by the way, every day I'm always surprised by people's interpretations of these guidelines. Just the other day, someone said to me, well, how often should I clean my cloth mask after I've gone out and come back home? And You're supposed to clean it every single time. So when I say to people, wear your mask, I made the assumption that they knew what I was talking about. But they don't necessarily. And so I need to even be clearer. We all need to be very clear so that people understand how to carry out these functions properly so that they really work.
Dr. Marty, would a stay-at-home order bring us closer to getting rid of this in our community?
Absolutely. There's no question that that would be the fastest way to be able to bring children back to school. But there's the price. And the price of a stay-at-home order right now could mean hunger, which we considered, because if people are hungry and starving and have no place to go, they may riot, band together and riot, which is going to increase the pandemic. So we had to balance these things out.
We did a survey, as you know, many parents know there were surveys done. And particularly in my district, Dr. Marty, was 51% wanted to return to school, 49% wanted to stay at home. If, we get to a place where the numbers are better in the fall, I, along with many parents, still worry about the probability that children could pass this to an adult who's a teacher. Then that teacher goes home with an elderly parent. That's one of my worries and many of the parents. Can you elaborate how this illness affects children and what, in terms of their spread, of whether they're asymptomatic or symptomatic, what kinds of children show symptoms? What can we do to learn more about how this affects children, Dr. Marty?
So that's a wonderful and very important question, because it leads us into a big problem in people's confusion between the virus, having the virus, and having the disease. And part of the problem is the way we've called the test. We keep saying, we're testing for COVID-19. We're not. We're testing for the virus. And that's why we talk about people who are asymptomatic. They have the virus, but they don't have COVID-19. They have SARS-CoV-2. And in the case of children have SARS-CoV-2 and acquire it at the same rate as anybody else. Even little tiny children, they still can have SARS-CoV-2. The good news is that for the most part, most children don't end up with COVID-19. They have SARS-CoV-2 without having COVID-19. So what are they? They're asymptomatic carriers, and they have loads of virus, high concentrations in their nasal and oral cavities. So they, in fact, can shed that virus and contaminate adults very well. In fact, several studies have shown that they carry just as much as anybody else. And a study from just yesterday in JAMA Pediatrics shows that children less than 5 years of age have more virus in their oropharyngeal tracts than older children and adults.
Obviously, with many children out there who could have had this, and we were at the beginning listening to reports that, children don't get this. And we weren't even testing children. So I still see, Dr. Marty, even in this, now everybody has to wear a mask in Miami-Dade, I still see a lot of children not wearing masks. And how do you deal with the issue of babies? Because they could be carriers as well. And it's hard to cover the mouth of a baby or a toddler. What are your recommendations for those parents?
So that's absolutely right. And the recommendation, for very good reasons, is that we don't put masks on children under 2. Above the age of 2, children are amazing. They're little sponges. If you tell them it's cold and you have to wear gloves and that's going to protect their hands, they wear their gloves. If they're going out in puddles on a cold and rainy day, they should be wearing boots, right? And if it's in a pandemic and they're going out and about where they could be contaminated, they should have on their little masks. And I know my grandchildren wear their little masks. They look adorable in them. And it's not really that hard. Even the 2-year-old grandson wears his little mask. It's a matter of telling them this is what you've got to do. And children can learn.
When schools reopen, what are some of the recommendations that you strongly feel? Obviously, the district is working very diligently to prepare for that day. But one is your top recommendations of, number one, how that classroom's going to look, whether it's the entry, how do we separate ourselves, physically distancing, how do we deal with this? Because there's just I have so many questions. And I know parents are going to have a lot of questions in that new world of that classroom.
There have been outbreaks in schools where schools have reopened in some countries, and even in countries with much lower viral burdens, that we've seen outbreaks from schools. But that's why we need to have several things. We need to have clear education of the children about what they have to do. We have to make accessible hand washing stations that are not inside bathrooms, because bathrooms have issues all their own with this virus. When you flush toilets, it gets into it gets into that bathroom and it's just a problem, et cetera, et cetera. So it'd be very good to install more hand washing stations that are not inside a bathroom.
The ones that you could just put your hands, you don't have to touch any of the knobs, right? I've seen them at some of the airports.
Yes, exactly. You don't touch any of the knobs, and the soap comes into your hand magically. Well, it's not magic, but of course.
Water drips down, and then you go to the dryer.
Well, I'm not a big fan of the dryer.
Oh, because it comes in the air?
Because it aerosolizes it. And, and there's people who don't like the paper because they think it's not good for the trees, but trees grow, right? I mean, we can replenish trees, and I don't see that as a big limitation.
So you see washing of the hands critically.
Washing of the hands is the best way to reduce that fomite transmission. And little kids are always, touching their faces, and it's very challenging to try and decrease that. Now, on that note, there is a lot of growing evidence, more and more every day. You saw that the WHO has adopted the reality that we're seeing of this aerosol transmission, which means little tiny itty bitty particles, not droplets anymore, but things that are less than 5 microns that accumulate, especially in a closed room. And we're moving towards recommending goggles or some kind of eye protection to decrease spread that way. And if you use some kind of a face shield, you're going to decrease that touching of the face, which is going to decrease the contamination of the environment, because you don't touch your face that might be contaminated, then, with the dirty hands, touch everything else.
Dr. Marty, I know you've seen some of those videos where they're sanitizing classrooms and the men go in with the mask and kind of like a hose. I also worry about all those chemicals sitting on the desk, on the walls. We've heard stories, and, you served in our military, what our veterans in combat, you're exposed to all these high chemicals and the consequences that, these children who are now going to be in this closed area and all these chemicals still floating in the air, just like COVID-19 floats in the air. How do we deal with that? Because those chemicals come with a whole host of warnings.
Yeah, so actually, I'm a big fan of using the UV type of sanitation precisely for that reason. The only problem with that is that the person doing the sanitation with the UV lights has to wear eye protection, because a UV light can damage their eyes. And so if the school system can afford it, and I've been trying to influence Congress to give them more money to the schools, because I think it's really important that schools in general have been underfunded for way too long. Teachers are underpaid, and the contribution of schools to society goes way beyond the obvious contribution, which is already tremendous, of educating our young and being our future leaders and workers and so forth. There's also all kinds of other important subtle contributions that having schools does for society. It allows parents to work, for example.
And I know that's one of the concerns for our parents. They in this whole pandemic, unfortunately, some of them have had to go to work, and our schools and our parents have really have to step up to supervise their child, as they finish the school year, and are worried about what's going to happen in the next few months if they have to go back to work. So yes, we need flexibility in the funding. There's now this whole increased attention to health in schools. And I grew up in schools in New Jersey where we had a nurse. There was a nurse in every school, and that conversation has started. And, my daughter had a nurse assigned to her in our school system because she's diabetic type 1. But I do feel that we do need a health professional in our schools to help every child. So I am very supportive of the steps that we're taking to not only bring a health officer, but to talk about getting a nurse placed at the school. And that's going to cost money. And we need that funding now to come from the federal and state levels. So we hope we will get that.
By the way, I also did elementary school in New Jersey. Yeah. So I'm well familiar with
our public schools.
Yeah, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, right.
West New York, where many Cubans went when they came to the United States.
Yeah, that wasn't where we started, but that's where we went. Yeah.
Dr. Marty, what recommendations would you give to parents who are worried about not only themselves getting this, their children? How can we best protect our children? Because that's always, I think about children and the elderly first. And then what type of children have you seen are the ones that are getting this illness, and how is it manifesting in their bodies?
So thank you. Those are all very important questions. So in our community, we have a high incidence of COVID-19 in children. And in fact, the United States, if you look at all the data, 7.1% of our cases of COVID are in children, which is very high. For example, in China, it was less than 2% were in children. So we have a very high incidence.
What percent are we again?
7.1.
Wow.
Just people
in the
under 18.
South Florida area,
In the South Florida area, we've been even higher, and we also have that increased risk of being Hispanic. And also Hispanics and then Blacks have the highest incidence of that post-infectious syndrome, the Kawasaki-like syndrome, sometimes called multisystem inflammatory disease. So in fact, Miami-Dade has 1/3 of all the Kawasaki cases of Florida.
In the worst cases that you've heard of children being infected, what has this done to children?
The worst is that we've had children die here in Florida from this infection with the SARS-2 virus. We've had children who've had complications and still do because of they have underlying disease generally, especially renal disease has been a problem in some of the children. And in addition, of course, we have this post-inflammatory syndrome, this multi-system inflammatory disease that can lead to problems of the heart with these children. And it really varies. The good news is most children do very well. We've only had, as of yesterday, only 5 children have died, but that's 5 children too many, if you ask me.
Yes, Dr. Marty. Dr. Marty, the other, maybe, I don't know, to dispel this rumor that I've heard, is that children who get COVID-19 will have continuous organ failure issues, and it will affect their development. Is that true?
We don't know. That the truth is, we do know that this virus gets into the brain. We know that one of the key symptoms that many people, adults and some children, have is a loss of smell. And that has to do with the virus getting into cells that are part of our neurologic system, right? The olfactory system is being affected, and the cells that support the brain in particular are also being infected. We don't know if there's going to be any long-term consequences. We certainly hope not, but we only have 7 months of studying this disease. It's very hard to know if there's going to be any future impact. And right now, we're not even sure what's going to happen if somebody gets it when they're young and didn't have symptoms, if they get it again, a different flavor, because there's a lot of information about other coronaviruses, because there's 7 coronaviruses now that infect humans. And we know these other coronaviruses, the ones that have been around are community spread coronaviruses that typically cause simple things like a cold, and a few children, mostly it's children that get these coronaviruses, these other coronaviruses, can have more serious disease, more serious respiratory disease. But none of them seems to cause long-term protection after you've had it. So they get reinfected within a year or two. And so what we don't know, and what we're very, very afraid of, because coronaviruses have this feature, is that the second time you get it, it's worse. And the third, even worse, kind of like dengue.
Mm-hmm. So there's no immunity level of protection once you've had COVID-19 and you get it again.
There's some, but we don't know how good it is or for how long it's going to last.
And Dr. Marty, I know during the summer, usually it's the time when parents go out and get all their children's vaccinations on record to be ready to come back to school. One of the first things that I did with my daughter was I said, "Oh, you didn't get the flu shot this year." So I ran out and I took her to, the Minute Clinic, and I said, "You have to get your flu shot." So now, we'll have the new flu shot for the fall. How can having the flu shot in the middle of this pandemic with COVID-19 help you, having it or not having it?
They're very different viruses, and having immunity to flu doesn't have anything to do with immunity to SARS-CoV-2. But here's the important point. You don't want to have both of them at the same time, because people that have both of them at the same time do worse than either of those two viruses. And we have a good vaccine for influenza. We should definitely use it for that reason. Second thing is the overall benefit of having a flu vaccine goes way beyond protection from influenza itself. Third thing is, we do know that the SARS-2 virus that causes COVID affects your white blood cells. In a way, it drops down those white blood cells that are so important for giving you immunity, drops your lymphocytes down. So it makes you more susceptible to other infections. So once you have the SARS-2 virus, if you become in contact with influenza, your odds of the influenza itself being worse are that much higher, which is sort of an explanation for the first thing I told you.
I've had the honor of listening to you for a long time and giving, our community this valuable advice during this time. Your public service, Dr. Marty, to our school district, to our families, to our community is to be commended. I look to you as our expert, and I know our school district is indebted to you for all of the work that you have done and will continue to do to help our families, our children, and, our teachers, our staff, everyone who we have to be responsible for. So I want to thank you, Dr. Marty, for your time. We could be here for hours because you're just a wealth of knowledge. Dr. Marty, anything you want to say to the community who's listening to you?
Yeah, I want to give one more idea to families that is happening in other communities, but you have to have a very, very strict contract. And that is some families with small children where the parents need to work and work at home. These are work at home parents with other families that also had the same situation and similar age children have formed a larger household. They've agreed not to visit their relatives or other friends, and they only exchange with each other so that the children go to one house and the parents in the other house can work, and then they flip them back so that everyone gets their work done. And that's a very interesting solution to this challenge that we're dealing with. But again, every member of this bigger bubble has to agree not to put the other members of the bubble at risk.
Thank you. That's a great idea. And I think, we all live in South Florida, all these blended families, and particularly some of us have, had their parents move in because we're afraid of also having our elderly out there. And I think there are things that we need to take personal responsibility for and look to find those solutions as we get through this pandemic, God willing. I don't know when we'll have a vaccine, Dr. Marty, right? We have no idea in terms of the progress. And I think until we get that, we won't all be safe. Correct, Dr. Marty?
That's correct. That or a prophylactic antiviral which is not looking like something that's very close right now. There is a lot of promise with some of these new technology vaccines, and we're going to have enough stockpile of them. But the new vaccines that just started the phase 3 clinical trial, you won't know those people that are being put into the trial, how good their immunity is for a year until a year has passed. Right. So when you hear them saying there's a vaccine's going to be ready in December, you go, well, wait a minute. There hasn't been enough time for the clinical trial to actually tell me everything I want to know about this vaccine.
So we're in this for the long haul, it seems, from everything that I'm seeing. So thank you, Dr. Marty. I want to thank you again for joining me in my chat. I think this is going to be a chat that's going to be listened to, and to hear your advice and your opinion, guiding our parents and our school district as we plan to reopen. We will have an announcement September 30th at the end of the month after we finish the first stage where we're in right now, as this community is still in phase 1, to be able to then make a decision and tell parents later in the fall what our next steps are. So everyone stay well. God bless. Dr. Marty, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all your amazing work at this time of crisis, as always.
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
That concludes this episode of Lubby's Chat, brought to you by Miami-Dade County Public Schools, produced by me, Janelle Yee, and hosted by School Board member Lubby Navarro. Please email District 7 at dadeschools.net with any questions or comments. Once again, our address is District 7 with the number 7 at dadeschools.net. For more information, visit our website, district7 at dadeschools.net. You can also call us at 305-995-1334. For updates, follow at Lubby Navarro on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube.